Have you ever noticed something strange about the spiritual journey? A person begins searching for peace. They start meditating. They read spiritual books. They listen to enlightened teachers. They spend years trying to understand themselves. And yet, somehow, they still suffer. For a long time, this puzzled me. How could someone sincerely walk a spiritual path and still feel trapped? Then I came across an insight that completely changed the way I looked at spiritual growth. The ego does not always disappear when we become spiritual. Sometimes it becomes spiritual, and that's where the real trouble begins. Most of us imagine the ego as arrogance. We think of someone who constantly seeks attention, wants to be admired, or believes they are better than everyone else. But the ego is far more subtle than that. It does not mind changing its clothes. If it can no longer identify with money, it may identify with spirituality. If it can no longer identify with success, it may identify with awakening. If it can no longer say, I am richer than you, it may begin saying, I am more conscious than you. The words change. The structure remains the same. And I find that fascinating. Because the ego does not necessarily care what identity it adopts. It only wants an identity. Perhaps you have noticed this in yourself. I know I have. You hear a beautiful teaching. You spend time in meditation. You begin to understand things that once seemed mysterious. And then a subtle thought appears. I understand this. Another thought follows. Most people don't. And before long, separation has returned through a different door. This is why many great spiritual teachers warned about the spiritual ego. Not because spirituality is dangerous, but because the mind can turn almost anything into a new identity. Even awakening, even humility, even simplicity. The ego can proudly declare, look how egoless I am. And somehow that does not sound quite right. One thing I deeply appreciate about Ramana Maharshi is that he continually brought seekers back to simplicity. Whenever people became lost in spiritual concepts, experiences, or achievements, he pointed them toward a direct question. Who am I? Not how advanced am I? Not how spiritual am I? Not how awakened am I? Simply, who am I? Because the moment we become preoccupied with spiritual status, we are already moved away from the essence of the inquiry. I sometimes think the spiritual path is a little like climbing a mountain. At first, you are focused on reaching the summit. But after a while, another temptation appears. You begin looking at other climbers. Who is higher? Who is lower? Who is progressing faster? Who is struggling? And suddenly the mountain is no longer the focus. Comparison is. Have you ever noticed how exhausting comparison can be? It steals joy from almost every area of life. And unfortunately, spirituality is no exception. A seeker compares meditation experiences. Someone else compares level of awareness. Another compares years of practice. Yet, peace remains strangely absent. Why? Because comparison always strengthens the sense of a separate self, the very thing we are trying to see through. One of the clearest signs of the spiritual ego is the need to arrive somewhere, the feeling that enlightenment is waiting in the future. Just one more retreat, one more book, one more realization, one more breakthrough. Of course, learning and practice have value. But sometimes I wonder whether we overlook something incredibly simple. What if peace isn't waiting at the end of the journey? And if it can only be found here, in this moment, not as an achievement, but as a recognition. This does not mean we stop growing. It does not mean we stop learning. It simply means we stop turning spiritually into another project for the ego. Because the ego loves projects, it loves goals, it loves becoming. Awareness, however, is already here. It does not need improvement. It does not need validation. It does not need a certificate of enlightenment. The more I reflect on this, the more I realize that genuine spirituality often feels surprisingly ordinary. There is less performance, less need to impress, less need to convince. There is a quietness, a naturalness, a humility that does not even know it is humble. Perhaps this is why the wisest people often appear the simplest. They are no longer trying to become someone. They are no longer carrying the burden of maintaining a spiritual identity. They are simply present. And there is something deeply beautiful about that. So, how do we recognize the spiritual ego when it appears? Not by fighting it, not by judging ourselves, not by creating another layer of guilt, simply by noticing. Notice the desire to compare. Notice the desire to appear spiritual. Notice the desire to be special. Notice the desire to arrive. Observe it with kindness. Observe it with curiosity, because awareness itself begins to dissolve what unconsciousness creates. Perhaps the final obstacle to awakening is not the ego we can easily see. Perhaps it is the ego hiding behind spiritual ideas, quietly claiming ownership of the journey, quietly turning awakening into an achievement, quietly whispering, "You are almost there." And maybe the greatest freedom comes when we stop chasing that voice altogether, when we stop trying to become enlightened, when we stop trying to become special, when we stop trying to become anything, and simply rest in what we already are, the awareness that has been present through every experience, every success, every failure, every spiritual pursuit, and every moment of seeking. Thank you for spending these moments with me. And before you go, consider this question. If there were no one left to impress, no one left to compare yourself with, no spiritual image left to maintain, who would you be? Perhaps the answer is closer than you think.